agroecological intensification at scale, experiences with indigenous crops in West Africa. I would like to invite our director for the Sustainable Agri-Food System, Dr. Jacqueline de Snap, to introduce today's speakers.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is so good to be here because Eva Weltzien and Fred Rattunde are some of my oldest and dearest friends, and also an inspiration through my entire career. So I first met them at ICRISAT in the mid-90s and was so excited about the participatory research around millet they're doing in the Rajasthan, the more marginal and interesting and beautiful places on the planet, and was so inspired by their work then. And then they moved to West Africa, and the rest is sort of history. For 20 years, they built up a sorghum, millet system, seed systems, thinking about the agroecology, which is where I got to work with them in various opportunities. And what really inspired me is that always, when you're with Fred and Eva, you know that the partners will be there, that they'll be there front and center, that you will meet elders from villages who have selected some striking sorghum variety for the edge of their rice field. You will meet an up-and-coming European who's now doing interesting work here at CIMMYT. You'll meet the next generation of breeders using the latest molecular biology with participatory action research. So it's no surprise that they won the Liebig World Nutrition Prize for their work, because they've made a difference in nutrition for so many farmers, but also in capacity. Back in the day, ICRISAT was known for, unfortunately, having brought sorghum varieties that were quite short. And as I'm standing in my tiptoes once again, trying to speak into this, I have no problem with being short. But the problem was that these hybrids, and actually at the time there wasn't any hybrids, regular sorghum varieties, they didn't meet the needs. They didn't provide the forage, they weren't high quality forage. And so they came in from India, from Zimbabwe, and they just were not acceptable varieties. As a soil scientist, I was using local lines because the improved varieties were just not improved. But now, 20 years later, we have hybrids, we have farmer cooperatives selecting their own varieties, we have molecular biology bringing us new types of forage quality in the sorghums. So this revolution in sorghums that is now meeting so many diverse needs of farmers is directly because Eva Weltzien and Fred Rattunde built this sorghum system with the national partners, with private, public, and civil society, farmers' organizations, as you're going to hear about, breeding varieties with farmers on their very marginal, very low soil organic matter, low phosphorus soils, that these new crops thrive now. I've never forgotten one farmer, our village elder I met through Eva in particular, who told me that we used to, in this area, people brought us beautiful dog's heads, but now they bring us sheep's heads. And in this area, we eat sheep's heads. So Eva and Fred have given the world better sheep's heads, and that's what the farmers wanted. And they've taught us all a new way. So I'm so excited that they're going to share some of their thoughts today at this seminar. Thank you again, Eva and Fred, for all you do, and over to you.
So thank you very much, Sig. As you may have heard, I unfortunately have to stay away from the podium and the auditorium because I tested positive for COVID-19. So I will be starting the presentation and Fred will take over about midway. So we want to share some of our experiences about organizing the breeding program for more specifically sorghum in most cases, and we'll talk a little bit about millet in West Africa. And we'll try to talk some about the breeding aspects, but try to focus more on the organizational aspects that are behind it. So, and we really look forward actually to a lively discussion, so we'll try and be quick. Just a quick overview to begin with. Can I have the next slide, please?
We're working on it. It will be
okay, great. This is a map of West Africa, showing you all these different bands of colors, and each color band is about 20 days difference in growing length season. So you can just count how many bands there are north-south in a country like a small country like Burkina Faso or Mali. It's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. And 20 days, as you all know, make a huge difference for which kind of variety people can grow. So this is challenge number 1 in West Africa for crops like sorghum and pearl millet that have to mature at the end of the rains because of the open exposed grains, not like maize that is covered by a husk. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of an impression, sorghum is grown all over West Africa from Senegal to Chad, and it continues into Sudan. In this band, just below the Sahara Desert, all the way into the northern Guinea zone, sometimes into the forest zones. So it's covering at least 3, 4, 5 of these bands that I just showed you in terms of length of growing season. So what I didn't show you, and it's difficult to show on a map, is that there isn't just this diversity north-south. If you travel from east to west in West Africa, you will find extremely different types of sorghum, and you will find very different types of biotic stresses. I'll not go into detail. It's just as a background for the kinds of diversity of growing conditions that sorghum is actually facing in this region. Next slide. This slide shows you one of the main constraints for any crop growth, any crop intensification in West Africa. It shows you the distribution of estimates of available phosphorus in the soils. And you can see the dark green ones, or anything green, is where it starts to be sufficient for crop growth, for a normal production. And you can see how much yellow there is. So soils in West Africa, extremely weathered old soils, extremely low phosphorus availability to plants. Most of it below the threshold of about 10 Bray-P. Next slide, please. So this is the bit of a background. When we moved to Mali in 2000, what was the situation in terms of farmers using seed of newly bred varieties? What was the organizational background to making a difference in farmers' lives? You all may remember, or some of you, the structural readjustments that many of these countries had to face. This consequence was that national seed services had all become dysfunctional. So there was actually basically no structure in the country producing or making seed available to farmers except for cotton, which was organized by the cotton company. Extension services were in a similarly dire situation because of that lack of funds. There were 0 private seed companies, no investment at all. In addition, we learned, and of course farmers cannot buy a seed if it's not even there, but even buying seed on the local market for sorghum was very rare. We did research with anthropology colleagues, and it became very clear that it's actually a disgrace for a farmer to have to buy seed or even to take seed from outside from somebody else. A good farmer produces his or her own seed. In terms of variety release, it was very uncomplicated. There was just an office. You could propose your variety, provide the data, and the variety was registered in a national catalog. And it was actually then possible to produce certified seed. It was possible, but it was expensive. There had been an adoption study. And as Sig already mentioned, those dwarf varieties were absolutely not being adopted. The new breeding materials that ICRISAT had proudly developed over the previous 15 years did not meet with farmers' interests. This is the situation that we took over basically when we moved to West Africa. So what did we do? Next slide, please. We initiated studies to understand actually what farmers are doing about their seeds, which kinds of varieties do they grow, and do they change, how do they change varieties? What's happening? Where do they get seed when they want something else? And we are just showing here you one example of the type of data that we collected, a kind of learning that was possible through this collaboration with a social scientist in the breeding program studying farmers' seed systems. It was very clear that farmers use many different varieties. Hardly any farmer uses only one variety. And the reasons for using different varieties in the same farm was really to deal with different growing conditions on the farm. Because you cannot plant everything at the same time. You may have different types of soil and different production objectives. Some people want to produce for market, others may produce more for feed, but everybody produces for food. The main goal for sorghum production was food security, some income generation, and interestingly, more often income generation by women than by men. Because men were responsible to ensure food security for the family. And so selling their big stock of sorghum was actually a social no-no. So in terms of varieties, a number of varieties, I just want to briefly show you this example on the graphic on the right. This is each line here represents a farmer who grew a variety in 2004 and which kind of varieties they are growing in 2009. And SML stands for short, medium, late. We just clubbed the varieties like that because there were too many varieties to do it by variety name. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are no straight lines that just go down. All the lines go in one or the other direction. That means all these 20 farmers who were interviewed in this village changed their varieties between 2004 and 2009. And it was like that in all the villages that we studied, and this was quite a number. So there is actually high dynamics of varietal change in those villages, and even the varieties that they grew in 2004, when that was not often before they started working with our program, the dominant varieties had not been in those villages for more than 10 years. Most of them were younger. Next slide, please. So just to cut a longer story a bit short, this is just a picture that we took at one of the workshops with the national programs from the West African countries, showing you with those dots. This was actually, it's a photograph of a map that I pinned on the wall where everybody pinned the sites where they conduct on-farm trials. So you can see that each pin is not a site, it's an area where they conducted trials. We counted at least 500 villages in that 1 year when we conducted the workshop where the trials had been conducted. It was, we had trained, and it wasn't us, it was the national programs trained at least 80 village level facilitators for conducting trials. Scientists have been trained, and you can see that new varieties started to move into areas in all of these countries. And Fred will talk to you a little bit more about what kind of trials and what are the type of results. We just wanted to highlight here that this was national programs running these trials in collaboration with mostly with farmer organizations and some of them with NGOs. Next slide, please. I want to share with you just a few learnings from these widespread intensive on-farm trials that highlight key issues that the breeding program needs to address. The data here come from on-farm trials in villages where we had a men's group and a women's group conduct on-farm trials with some of the same sorghum varieties. And we sampled soil in those villages at the same time in the men's trials and in the women's trials. And you can see here the Bray P values. This is only for Mali, actually, from this large number of trials, some 100 something, showing how in general, how low the phosphorus availability in those fields is. Most of the trials were below the sufficiency level, except a few of the men's fields, the orange bars. And you can see that almost 70% of women's trials were actually below 4 Bray P, which is almost no phosphorus available in those soils. So there's this dramatic difference between men's fields and women's fields. And the men's fields, it's actually maybe wrong to call them men's fields. It's the big family fields that support food security for the family, whereas women as individuals get allocated land to grow some crops on their own. And usually they will get fields, as you can say, at the end of rotation. So when the field is no longer good enough to produce crop for the family food security. So women use these fields, they grow mostly legumes, but they will intercrop most of the time with sorghum for additional income. Next slide.
Go a little bit, Eva.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you beautifully.
Okay, good. One other issue is, what do people do with this grain that they harvest? And I mentioned already the food security, to make sure that we understand how the sorghum is actually being used. We ended up conducting regularly with our trials culinary tests in the villages in the dry season, a perfect venue for discussing all kinds of things around sorghum, and at the same time testing processing qualities. And I will not go into detail on this slide, but just explain to you the next slide. One key issue we found out through these trials was actually losses that women observed when they process sorghum grain, because sorghum grain is actually decorticated by hand. So if the grain is too soft or maybe too hard, a lot of grains will be lost in the process of the decortication. And so what you see here in this graph is the range we observed in one of those trials on the losses from decortication when tested in the village. And you can see that it goes from above 25% to around 10%, and that is a huge range. So if you lose 25% of your crop just because of in processing, any 10% yield increase is not going to be worth anything. So this food yield, how much food can you actually harvest from a hectare, became a guiding principle in decision-making about moving varieties forward. Next slide, please. Just one other impression in all of these trials, we conducted regular field visits with people from the same villages where the trials were conducted, discussed about which traits farmers wanted to actually evaluate. We always said we cannot evaluate, they cannot evaluate more than 3. And so you can see here the frequencies with which certain traits were chosen. And I'm sorry, the slide is in French. The top one, rendement, means yield, and cycle means earliness or growth duration. Then comes forage, lodging, the leaves, the panicles, and striker resistance. And you can see that most people were interested, most in the 3 different colors is 3 different areas in the same zone, in the same agroecology. And you can see that way that yield and flowering, of course, are the most important traits. Wherever you see stars, we had significant differences in the scores for those traits between men and women. So just to give you an idea about the diversity or the interest in diversity among these farmers for different types of sorghum varieties. Next slide, please. So as a kind of summary of these discussions that come from mostly interactions with farmers, around these trials and around annual planning and evaluation meetings with the different groups in the different areas. We have a list of traits, and it looks very similar to some of your product profiles that need to be addressed. And you can see in the second column our assessment of what needs to happen. If you see there improve, it means there needs to be some improvement so that a variety can be interesting to farmers. All the other traits need to be at acceptable levels. There will be thresholds below which farmers will not adopt your variety if that threshold is not met. So you can see here that those threshold, there are many of these kinds of threshold traits, and a few traits that we figured are important to improvement upon. And you can see that the local farmer varieties have most of those traits, of course, that are necessary, the acceptability traits. But they may lack the yield. There has never been any breeding work done with those local varieties. And Fred will talk a bit more about that. They are very tall and have actually very poor stover quality. And so the introduced germplasm, which is the germplasm that most breeding programs have been working with, has, of course, high yield potential, but not under those conditions, because as you can see, it's not adapted. For none of those traits does the introduced germplasm meet those acceptability criteria. It does have improved stover quality, and it may bring striker resistance. So this is the task, the situation that we were trying to address. Increasing grain yield became the top priority. We also realized that the on-station conditions poorly represent the context in farmers' fields. Our population of target environments is very diverse and highly complex. Each country may have at most one research station in agroecology. There are these many traits that are important for adaptation and for use. And many of those traits are actually difficult to observe on individual plants. So they are complex. So Fred will take you to the next steps. How did we address some of those issues?
Thank you, Eva. And to carry on, one first question was, of course, what germplasm base do we use for breeding? And here are, for sorghum, the 5 major races as defined by Helen and DeWitt, of which 4, all but Kafir, are cultivated by farmers in West Africa, in Mali, even in a single village. However, going back to the snapshot, let's say the year 2000, in the breeding community, there was a very, very strong emphasis on the introduced caudatum because it was thought that had the yield potential, whereas most of the farmers, the predominant race that was being cultivated was the Guinea, which is exemplified by this tall plant picture on the right, with many tags. That was a selection experiment, and farmers appreciated that type of plant type. So over the years, there was great emphasis on using the local Guinea race germplasm and breeding to build on that with this array of adaptation traits, with introducing diversity from introduced sources, but at a good dose, meaning like at 25% or less. So you still have basically the base of the local germplasm, but with new and diversified opportunities. With that germplasm then, in the breeding cycle, it would go into selecting in the new diversity and then evaluating progenies that are developed. And for farmers, it's not only researchers that are very keen on testing. And the question is, where, under what conditions, how is it being tested, and who is testing? Is it on station? Is it by breeders, by farmers? Is it on farm? And that was really a major area for us. And also, is it during the growing season? Is it also post-harvest after the growing season? This was an area that over the years we were able to learn together a great deal. And here we have it was a major entry point, was actually what became called as the 32 trials, 32 plots. At first, 32 varieties, but after the first year or two, farmers and the researchers agreed it's better to have half that number, but with 2 replications. So it was actually split into 2 trials. One was often the shorter variety, or intermediate. Short means taller than me, but not 3 meters tall, and the other trial was tall. There would be in total about 30 or 40 participating farmers spread over 10, 12 villages across the zone. And in discussions with farmers, the farmers actually suggested testing the same varieties 2 years in a row because each year could be very different. The farmers managed the trials, planting also with local farmer organization facilitators. The farmers were scoring the trials, and as Eva mentioned, in the group evaluations, deciding which criteria, which traits to evaluate. Breeders analyzed and summarized the data collected, including yield, and the colorful table on the right is one example of that summarization table. This is of yield in one of the 3 districts, or 3 areas, where we have the variety name in the first column going down. Each column is a different farmer, grouped by village. The yields in 100 kilo sacks, a unit that the farmers easily recognize. With on the very bottom, the mean yield of that farmer's trial and the repeatability, which farmers within a short time grew to appreciate and understand. And such tables were important in the regular feedback and planning meetings that were held after the completion of one season and in preparing for the upcoming season's activities. Here, just to show you some results coming from those trials, the first graph on the left is variety trials of open pollinated varieties, with showing it's the yield of, here we have yield on the y-axis and the mean trial yield, the site mean yield on the x-axis. We can see the response of varieties across the full set of trials. And for the first time, we could actually say, we have some varieties that yield better than the farmers' local varieties. Not just in a single site, but it's across environments. And this, the top black line was actually a variety derived out of the Guinea race broad-based population improvement program, compared to the local variety, which are actually at the two lower lines there. The same local check in the graph to the right, blue, compared to, and this is now hybrids, new hybrids that first were created in 2008, and then afterwards, based on local germplasm, based on local variety parents. And we could see a big jump in productivity, 30 to 40% yield superiority, and that superiority was maintained across the full range of environmental conditions. It was not only under more favorable, but also under less favorable conditions. Where that data came from, here we have southern Mali, and all of the black points are farmer cooperatives, the round black points. There's some 3 asterisks. Those would be unions of cooperatives. And then the pink are the research stations, which you can see between the national program and ICRISAT, very limited. But with the farmers' collaboration, oops, what happened here? Okay, good. So we'll go on to a question of, besides testing and those trials that I mentioned, those were early generation. They were F4, which is quite earlier than many people are using for testing for yield and with farmers. But we were wondering about even earlier generation, when we have more diversity and where the funnel is really restricting what diversity is advanced. And we tried to learn by doing, with 150 progenies, with testing on farm, testing and selecting on farm. In this case, then, 27 farmers in 1 year, each getting only a subsample. It was 50 lines with a single row, single replication with repeated checks, compared to on station, where the full set was tested under 2 fields, one managed under low fertility, low phosphorus, no phosphorus fertilization long-term, and one under recommended conditions. 12 progenies were selected out of the total 150 in each, on farm and on station. Between the two, there were 3 that were in common. Just on the right, some, we can say reality check, the heritability, the ability to distinguish, to discriminate between these progenies. On station, it was better than on farm generally, except, on station, low phosphorus comparable to on farm. But we look at the genetic correlation of the on station results with performance on farm. We see that actually the highest correlation was under low phosphorus conditions. And the right column is an estimation of the relative efficiency of selection. It's prediction. simply based on quantitative genetics. But we had something more than just this prediction. For the following 2 years, those 20, it's actually 22 selected progenies were tested by a total of 33 farmers over 2 years in their farmer managed conditions, and to see what was the actual performance. And we have here, if you can see the colors, most importantly, the red sticks out. Those are the 3 progenies that were chosen both on farm and on station. And the checks, there are 3 checks in black. One of them is very low, the others are mixed in. We do have actually yield opportunities for yield superiority over the farmer varieties. Farmer variety checks appreciated and cultivated by farmers. So that was a learning for us, that it is possible for really early generation. This was from the population breeding S1, S2 progenies. To look at the phosphorus, selecting under low and high phosphorus conditions on station, to be even more secure, a series of trials were conducted by the National Program and ICRISAT over 4 years under low phosphorus managed and recommended conditions. And here it was a panel of 60 varieties, including farmer varieties, land races, and improved varieties. And the yield of those varieties on the y-axis, and here we have on the x-axis, it's the plant available phosphorus levels in those fields. So we're plotting their yield against the available phosphorus in the field. And what we see is the highest ranking variety under high favorable phosphorus in red, and the highest ranking variety under the low phosphorus conditions in blue, and they actually have a crossover. And interestingly, that crossover is at it's at about 10 ppm, which is at about the highest possible, the threshold for sufficiency for sorghum. And important learning from this is looking at the lower end, the 8 trials without phosphorus are basically all below 10 ppm, and that is where we have discrimination for performance under low phosphorus, that we could not discriminate under high phosphorus recommended conditions. So moving forward, on-farm testing is possible, it's feasible, but through the years of working with these farm organizations, there was learning that it doesn't assure large-scale awareness or dissemination of new varieties. It still stayed in the village or within the farm family, or even within the farmer, that mostly men for the big trials, the 32 trials, that although in discussions then these farmers themselves were discussing, well, how does the seed now get used and get out? And the farmers, collaborating farmers, decided themselves to start producing seed, and it was their decision to produce certified seed because they felt that was recognition of the quality of their seed and efforts. Farmers established seed cooperatives among farmers who were collaborating in the variety testing, and there was, for a number of years annually, a doubling of the amount of certified seed that they are producing. And learning as well that simply with the production of seed does not assure the dissemination of seed, and that these farmer cooperatives then began to explore options that they themselves could be active in marketing and disseminating seed in their areas. in various ways. Here's a snapshot to give a picture of what the diversity of varieties that were being produced and disseminated by these farmer seed cooperatives. And we have the three regions, that's why the map is there on the right. Mande, which was, you could say, the least intensified. It was not a strong cotton growing area. The most humid, the least amount of livestock or crop livestock integration, livestock feeding was not an issue, compared to Djuela and Kutiala, much stronger, older cotton growing areas, more intensified. And we see first on the bottom, the total number of varieties that each area is producing, different varieties in that time period. Most of them were new varieties. Most of them were coming through the collaborative breeding effort. And the varieties were 10 years or younger in age. Another interesting difference is looking at the open pollinated variety, the dual purpose, which was a new type of variety. It wasn't dwarf, but it wasn't tall. It was intermediate to 2.5 meters tall, with superior stover quality for livestock feeding, which does not exist in the local varieties. And that was really emphasized in the choice of varieties for seed production, the choices being made by the seed cooperatives themselves, by the seed producers. They were choosing which varieties to produce in Djuela and Kutiala. I mentioned the unions of farmer cooperatives. And in the various activities, and here this is a figure that is showing the ULPC, the Union Local de Producteurs de Céréales of Djuela, with cooperatives in different colors, cooperatives that are only testing varieties, cooperatives that are testing and producing seed of varieties, and cooperatives that are only producing seed of varieties. Each of those circles with the subcircles is a district. So there are several cooperatives within a district, and you can see many districts. And it really was difficult for communicating, for having trust, and being on the same page, so to speak, with this diversity. And the union developed, with facilitation, the idea of organizing seed committees, both at the local district level and a central seed committee, in which there would be discussion, decisions made, and communication within the district and between the district and the union, and in collaboration with all of the other actors in the dark blue circles. So this brings us to almost the end, but we do want to mention agroecology and the principles of agroecology, which are very many, to which breeding contributes. But what jumps out at us are particularly, one, biodiversity, enhancing, maintaining biodiversity in agroecosystems. Another is participation in decision-making and adaptive management of the agricultural and food systems, and in co-creation of knowledge, of local and scientific innovations. And just some parting thoughts for organizing breeding and seed innovations to contribute to biodiversity. First, that farmers are joining in as full partners in the priority setting, not simply as being consulted, that there's explicit effort to and creating opportunities by targeting functional diversity. What varieties offer new options? It's also targeting multiple options, multiple products, and particularly from, for example, developing broad-based population source material that could be shared and given to diverse people, organizations, with the basic level of acceptability for the many traits needed for cultivation, adaptation, and use, but with improvement for a particular trait, that they then themselves can go in and pull out materials of interest with a particular adaptation in terms of traits in terms of height or maturity or grain characteristics, color, etc. Of course, that sharing of work is really, really super for biodiversity, because it's not the few breeders coordinating everything because they can't do everything, but if there can be taking on responsibilities by others to share and to lead activities. Another aspect and beauty of this collaboration is that it allows the necessary integration of breeding and seed actions and innovations. And a final point is to remember to attend to inter-varietal diversity, which is important not only for biodiversity, but also for resilient and good performance of the varieties. And for co-creation of knowledge and participation. I'd mentioned these routine feedback and planning meetings. Those were really, really powerful, but also I'd like to mention every interaction, discussions also in the field, visits, farmer-to-farmer visits in the field, farmer evaluations, the research is with farmers on station or on farm, with concrete varieties in concrete context for discussing. Two-way exchange, farmer-to-farmer exchange, and especially in the feedback and planning meetings, also in the culinary tests, it gave voice to women and men. They had roles and expertise to share, and they grew and shared and all gained. And it also provided opportunities for other stakeholders, for local extension agents, NGOs, etc., to participate and join. And maybe a last point, maybe a hidden fantastic opportunity is, even in breeding, strengthening farmer organizations as a real key and clue for growth and innovation. Recognizing farmers and farmer organizations as having expertise, capacities in seed and variety issues, emphasizing and supporting group activities, organizing, functioning, governance, and fostering the participatory process, particularly for setting and adapting research priorities, because it is an evolving process, and with continued learning, there's continued refinement or new directions developed. And finally, recognizing farmer seed co-ops as enterprises, and all of this private sector business are the farmer seed cooperatives or farmer cooperatives present. And with that, thank you very much. And would like to also mention in the, I'm afraid, too fine print, but the many, many people, the many, many organizations, farmer organizations, national programs, and other researchers who contributed, and the many ICRISAT who supported and continues to engage in these types of activities, and the many partners for funding. Thank you very much. So we'd love to have opportunity, if there are any questions, and to follow up in any way possible. Is someone able to help if there are questions from online? So there's Paswell, excuse me. Marinha?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, both of you, Eva and Fred, for a beautiful presentation. I wanted to ask just really quick about intra-variety diversity. Does that mean that you sort of deprioritize hybrids? So that's my first question. Second one, you also suggest, which I've also thought about in the past, have multiple varieties, but that places a burden on seed production and delivery. Commercial systems will work well with just one product which they specialize in, I guess, a few. But so does the idea of having multiple varieties really sit okay with the private sector, or does that mean this has to be informal community-based systems that you have emphasized in here? Thank you so much once again for that elaborate and very informative presentation.
Thank you so much for the questions. Really appreciated. I'll start out first. Intervarietal diversity and particularly hybrids questioned. Actually, hybrids, in a sense, have heterozygosity, so there's some genetic diversity there, even though they are, the hybrids for sorghum are single cross hybrids. But something that we didn't have time to mention was farmers saving seed of those hybrids. And farmers actually learning which hybrids are better for saving seed of, and growing those for 2-3 years. And there's great intra-varietal diversity in the F2 saved seed. And actually, interestingly, the hybrids that were based more on the traditional tall local varieties, the Guinea race, pure Guinea race, there was one hybrid that is particularly preferred and said, farmers, this we can grow for several years as saved seed. For OPVs, it is an issue for sorghum of having intervarietal diversity because in the Guinea race, there's 30% outcrossing. And with farmers having their selection practices of selecting many panicles, they're maintaining that intervarietal diversity. With breeders who are doing selfing, that actually can be lost, and we actually believe we have seen inbreeding depression in our sorghum varieties. And so one example was the male parent of that super hybrid that farmers most preferred, also a variety on its own, coming from the Guinea population. The last stages of selection, we provided to the farmer with many progenies, and the farmer expert in seed and selection was purifying and developing the finished variety, which was true to type for visual traits, but being bulked from many sister lines, he had intervarietal diversity. Regarding multiple varieties in the private sector, first of all, the farmer seed cooperatives are seed enterprises, and they are in Mali producing, you saw the figure, the number of varieties within zones in a responsive manner to the interests of farmers in their zones. So those are my thoughts. And Eva, would you like to complement?
Yeah, maybe just on this general fear about the diversity of varieties. If you work with this kind of farmer organizations as breeding programs, it's automatic that they will develop different varieties. And they will produce the varieties that they want. but they have chosen them based on results across certain zones. So as Fred showed you those tables are available to all the farmers who are participating in all these trials. So they will choose the varieties based on multi-location yield results, but based on their observation and local preferences for certain of these adaptive or use traits. And I don't see any problem with diversity dissemination if they manage it, which is absolutely the case. And they manage many varieties anyway in their system. It is not a challenge, it's nothing new. So I think it's really building on that competencies of farmers to actually disseminate that, continue using that type of diversity. There was a question in the chat relating to the same issue, and are farmers buying seed regularly? The cooperatives are learning that farmers are mostly buying seed when they want something new. So it's been one aspect of the success of the cooperatives is to keep on offering new things. So it's not really this kind of marketing of one variety for many years that keeps them in business. It's actually marketing new things very regularly that keeps them basically interesting to their fellow farmers. Maybe one thing that we didn't mention here at all is the issue of actually having money to buy seed at the time of sowing is very critical in West Africa, because it's at the time when the food stocks are already low, the time of sowing. So nobody has actually cash left over. So the cooperatives actually have are creating other types of opportunities for people to access seed on kinds of credits which they may reimburse in grain, because most of those cooperatives are also actually marketing grain on larger scale. So it's trying to work around some of the challenges that farmers have to buy new seed, that the cooperatives are also playing a key role to make that work.
Thank you, Eva. And thank you for the comments and questions posted in the chat. I'd just like to come back to one question of complex multi-criteria for breeding and how that can be organized beyond yield assessment. And just like to emphasize that, first of all, the participatory variety testing was involving multiple criteria, not only yield, which is was presented, but the spider net diagram was another type of result. The criteria that farmers chose for evaluating and scoring these test progeny, test entries. And it was the farmers themselves deciding which traits to observe. And the post-harvest, the culinary test, the cooking test in the villages, in which the farmers were being presented the summarized data of yield as well as the scores for the traits, the evaluation traits, chosen by participating farmers in the field visits at the end of the season for choosing of the 30 or so varieties, maybe about 5 of which would go into this replicated processing, taste testing event at the village level with many farmers. Could I
would actually like to address the question. It's kind of a continuation what Peter Coldrake put in this chat. How much better does a new variety need to be before a farmer will buy the seed of that new variety? I think it's become quite obvious. If the only difference is yield, and you have seen that the average yield level on these low phosphorus soils is about a ton. A 10% yield difference you cannot see, but you can see 20, 30, 40%. So it has to be more than 20% yield so that farmers actually see that yield advantage. And that is really what we achieved with those hybrids. So the hybrids, making those hybrids available really changed that way the possibility that farmers realized, yes, sorghum can do more. And interestingly, was once people tried out those hybrids on their low poor soil fertility fields and realized really, yes, we can get higher yields, they actually started experimenting with fertilizer. So it's in that order that people try out the technologies. The other issue about newness is if varieties offer some really clear no advantages. So like we had varieties that were high in iron and zinc, and we could include them in farmer field school type training of women's with young children for nutrition. And then they adopted those varieties because they had all the other traits and were better for iron, for example. Or those varieties with improved stover quality, they had not much improved grain yields, but they had significantly improved stover quality. So there was a clear element of newness that made farmers interested in the varieties. And of course, the other level of newness is always the flowering date. So farmers are always interested to have a range of varieties of different flowering dates available, and they are keen to expand that range. Yeah, so earliness was important, but not the extreme earliness of those unadapted varieties that ICRISAT had introduced earlier.
Thank you again so much. I just wanted to point out that we are over the hour, and that if anyone wants to do follow-ups, there is going to be plenty of opportunity the next 2 days, hybrid, to meet with Eva and Fred, virtually with Eva, and just email me at SNAP, S-N-A-P-P, or s.snapp@cgir.com, that, you know, to organize anytime you want to meet with them. Also, I just want to thank everyone again for participating today and for their fantastic presentation. And I had one quick question, if there's time, and again, we understand people need to leave. At the end, one of the things you pointed out and challenged us around was this farmer-to-farmer exchange, the exchanging with researchers as part of the learning process. A number of the work around on-farm testing of varieties or early lines has often been about product profiling. It seems to be more about surveys. We've been talking about tries to do fast surveys, we can get information back. But I'm wondering if is there any way we can include surveys as a way to do exchange? Have you ever done any of that? Or does it really need to be this in-person kind of learning together? Any thoughts on that? And we can continue that conversation. Thank you.
Eva?
Well, yeah, I can, you know, we did some surveys when we had a social scientist with us, they did the surveys. We are plant breeders, we didn't feel comfortable to do surveys. And so, and we moved into a situation that we did not understand very well. So this learning was very much necessary on our part. And it was most effective if you actually can see what's going on, if people can explain to you right there and then why certain things are the way they are, or that you can start understanding why certain things are done the way they're done, so that you can place it into context and understand where there could be a new opportunity. And that's, I think, really one thing I would always like to strengthen in these kinds of discussions of survey versus other kinds of interactions. I think for a breeder, it's really important to actually have a chance to identify with farmers where their new opportunities could come from. And it is very difficult for a social scientist who doesn't really know the breeding material and what is possible from breeding to identify those opportunities. So it's really this, I really want to plead for more collaboration and interaction between social science and plant breeders to become better at this kind of learning and documentation at the same time. Yeah? our problem was very often that, yeah, we learned a lot, but we couldn't document it because it wasn't done in a social science acceptable manner.
And could
So
I just,
if it's for a shared learning as a science, it would be way better that this research is done collaboratively with plant breeders and social scientists, and then of course the farmers involved.
And also, just to further highlight, even a very specific social science aspect, gender, and the experience with gender surveys that were done then without involving in their development those who were involved in the participatory variety testing in formulating the framework, that they're really, that type of collaboration, interdisciplinary from the beginning is really, really helpful. In fact, could just come back to Philip asked a question about motivation of farmers for participation in these activities. And I'd first like to say that a universal experience has been that farmers are keen to observe new diversity. That there's a genuine innate interest in the topic of seeds and varieties. And all of this was voluntary. There was no payment. There was reimbursement in providing some materials, for example, for farmer facilitators, raincoats and boots to go to the fields, and ropes to measure, and tape measures, that it was voluntary. And it was really important that it was a group activity, not individual farmers for organizing, that there's that farmer to farmer exchange and learning together. And it's a group decision whether to do an activity or not. We actually did, over the years, develop, together with the national program and the farm organizations, if you will, the guidelines, requirements for participation. One was that there would be a critical number of farmers who are testing. And so that was for these 32 variety trials, 4 farmer testers per village. Otherwise, it's not representative, and if you have a failure, you have nothing, and you don't have the possibility of exchange. The second stage of testing, which we didn't talk about, what we called adaptation trials, which was much more entirely farmer managed, varieties that farmers wanted to see on their own fields at a much larger scale. During these feedback and planning meetings, could choose particular varieties, or after the meeting, varieties that they wanted to receive small packets of, that they would grow like 3 or 5 new test varieties in their field. With many, many trials, hundreds, with unfortunately limited data being collected and being shared with all. It's an issue of information management, but an opportunity for improvement. At the second stage, that many more farmers could have their hands directly on the seed and in their fields. That there were, over the years, within an organization, individuals who started testing and then didn't want to continue, but other farmers joined in, or an entire village would decide, no, we don't want to continue, but other villages came in. So it was dynamic, but it was a network that continued as a network. So thanks. And Eva, I don't know if there's any questions that we've missed. And no questions. So Eva?
I think that those are the main issues. There's of course many more details we could go into. Somebody asked about what stage we did the food and grain quality testing. It was always done after these 32 entry trials that Fred talked about, which were F4, F5s. So it gave us the chance that way to really eliminate rather early in the procedure varieties that didn't meet those criteria, which was really important because that had been the problem, one of the basic problems of the breeding program earlier, that they carried forward too much material that was not at all usable from the quality perspective.
Thank you so much for the many good questions, and we'd love to stay in contact, exchange with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you again for a wonderful, really thought-provoking presentation, for everyone who participated, and look forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks again, Eva and Fred.